Rain tapped against the roof of the alien city as David walked slowly down the long street. The night air was filled with strange neon lights, buzzing signs, and the voices of vendors calling out, but David's eyes were fixed on the tall building at the corner. The sign above the rusted metal doors read only one word in 3 languages: shelter. He pulled his coat tighter and pushed the door open. Inside, the sound of children filled the air. Dozens of alien children of different shapes and colors ran across the floor, some with scales, some with long ears, some glowing faintly under the pale lights. The smell of stale food and disinfectant was heavy in the air. The workers, tall and thin with sharp eyes, moved about with tired faces. They looked at David like he didn't belong here. A human in this part of the city was rare. David ignored the stares and let his eyes move across the large room. He saw laughter. He saw fights, he saw fear, but none of it was what he came for. He had heard a whisper in the marketplace about one child in this shelter, a child no one wanted. People said she was cursed, broken, not worth feeding. Something about the cruel words had stayed in his heart. He had to see her. In the far corner, past the noisy groups, he finally saw her. A tiny figure, smaller than most children, sat curled on the cold floor with her knees against her chest. Her hair, pale like silver threads, hung down and covered her face. Her clothes were torn and dirty, clearly never replaced. Around her, the noise of the shelter seemed far away. She was like a shadow in the corner, silent, unmoving, as if the world had already forgotten her. David walked closer. One of the staff stepped in front of him, shaking his head. "Not that one," the worker said in a flat voice. "She's useless. Doesn't speak, doesn't eat, doesn't even look at people. No family wants her. We keep her only because the law says so." The man's eyes narrowed. "Trust me, human. Don't waste your time." But David stepped past him. He could feel the weight of the room's eyes on him. The other children paused their play, curious to see what he was doing. He knelt down slowly, close enough to see her small hands pressed tightly together, trembling as if she was cold even in the heated room. "Hey," David said softly. His voice carried no command, no judgment, just warmth. "Can you look at me?" For a long moment, nothing happened. She didn't move, didn't react. It was like speaking to stone. Then, as if his words had broken through a wall, she lifted her head just slightly. A pale face appeared from behind the curtain of hair. Her eyes, large and glowing faintly blue, met his for only a second before dropping back down. But that 1 second was enough to make David's chest tighten. Those were not the eyes of a curse. They were the eyes of someone who had lost everything. Gasps came from the staff behind him. "She never looks at anyone," one whispered. "What is this?" David ignored them. He smiled gently at the girl. "My name is David," he said. "I came here to find you." Her small fingers dug into her knees. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence told him more than words ever could. She expected him to walk away, just like everyone else had. She was ready for rejection. But David stayed on the floor, lowering himself until he was at her level. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. "I'm not leaving you here." The workers behind him started muttering angrily. "You can't be serious. Out of all the children, you choose her?" Another added, "She's broken, human. She'll only bring you pain." David turned his head slightly, his voice firm now. "Maybe she's not broken. Maybe she's just waiting for someone to care." He looked back at the girl, who still hadn't moved. He reached out his hand slowly, careful not to frighten her. The air was tense. The room seemed to hold its breath. Would she reject him like she rejected everyone else? Would she stay locked in her silent world forever? For a long moment, her hand didn't move. But then, so faintly that even David almost missed it, her fingers twitched. She lifted her head again, and this time her eyes stayed on him longer. There was fear in them, but also a tiny spark, like a candle fighting against the dark. David's heart raced. He whispered the words that sealed his choice. "Come with me." The shelter staff burst into arguments. "This is madness," one shouted. "You'll regret this," another warned. But David didn't hear them. The only sound that mattered was the quiet breath of the girl in front of him. She didn't take his hand, not yet, but she didn't turn away either. And in that fragile silence, David knew the decision had already been made. He wasn't going to leave her behind. As he stood, the girl slowly rose to her feet. Her thin frame shook as if her legs had forgotten how to stand. David stayed beside her, shielding her from the stares of the crowd. Together, they walked toward the door. The workers shouted, the other children whispered, but none of it mattered. When the door opened, the cold night air rushed in. The girl paused, her eyes wide at the sight of the street beyond. It was her first step toward a world she never thought she'd see again. She clung weakly to David's coat, like a shadow holding on to light. And as they stepped out into the rain, no one in that shelter could believe what they had just seen. The saddest girl in the building, the one thought to be broken forever, had chosen to follow a human. What would come next? No one could predict. David's small home was quiet when he pushed the door open with the girl beside him. The room was warm, but she still shivered as if she were standing in the middle of a storm. She stepped inside slowly, her bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. David closed the door and hung his coat. For a long time, she just stood near the entrance, staring down at the ground, refusing to move further. "Come on," David said gently. "This is your home now." His voice was soft, careful, like someone speaking to a bird that might fly away at any second. He pointed toward the small table with 2 chairs. "Let's get you something to eat." He brought out a bowl of warm soup, steam rising from it. He placed it on the table in front of her and stepped back, giving her space. She looked at the bowl, but didn't touch it. Minutes passed. David sat across from her, pretending to eat from his own bowl, but his eyes kept flicking to her. She didn't lift the spoon, didn't taste anything. She just stared at the soup as if it were something strange. Finally, she pushed the bowl away slightly with her thin fingers and dropped her gaze again. David sighed but didn't push her. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to eat right now." Night came. David gave her a blanket and showed her the small bed in the corner. She didn't lie down. Instead, she sat on the floor with the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes stayed open long into the night, watching the shadows on the wall as if they were old enemies waiting to grab her. When David finally fell asleep, he was woken by a soft sound. At first, he thought it was the wind outside, but then he realized it was a voice. The girl was whispering in her sleep, speaking in her alien tongue. The words were broken, heavy with pain. He couldn't understand them, but the tone was clear. It was the sound of crying, of begging, of fear. She turned on the floor, her small hands clutching the blanket as if holding on to life itself. David's chest ached as he listened. He wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how. The next day, David searched through the adoption papers again. Hidden between them, he found an old file written by the shelter. A single word was written as her name: Lyra. David whispered it under his breath. It felt fragile on his tongue, but also alive. He tried saying it near her. "Lyra." He called softly. She didn't react, but he thought he saw the smallest flicker in her eyes. Day after day, David tried small things. He cooked food and placed it near her, hoping she would take a bite when he wasn't looking. He left toys and small trinkets on the table, hoping one might catch her attention. He even played soft music from his old device, wondering if sound might reach where words could not. But Lyra stayed locked inside her silence. She moved only when necessary, always avoiding his eyes, always retreating into her corner. David began to worry. He asked himself if the shelter workers had been right. Maybe she was too broken. Maybe no one could fix her. But each time the thought came, he pushed it away. He had seen her eyes that night in the shelter. There had been a spark there. He couldn't abandon her now. One evening, after a long day of trying, David fell asleep in the chair near the table. His body was heavy with exhaustion. He didn't notice the blanket slipping from his shoulders. In the middle of the night, a faint sound stirred him. He opened his eyes slightly but didn't move. Lyra was standing near him. She moved like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound. In her small hands, she held the blanket that had fallen. For a moment, she just looked at him, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, she bent down and carefully placed the blanket over him again. She adjusted it clumsily, her thin fingers tugging the edges until it covered him properly. David kept his eyes half closed, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't want to startle her. He let her finish, and when she stepped back into the shadows, he whispered one word under his breath, so quietly he wasn't even sure she could hear. "Thank you." Lyra froze for a second, then returned to her corner without a sound. But in that small act, something had changed. The next morning, David woke up feeling different. The memory of her kindness burned bright in his mind. It was small, but it was proof that she cared, proof that she had not been lost completely. She had reached out, even if only for a moment. He tried again that day, calling her name gently. "Lyra," he said as he set the food down. She didn't look up, but she didn't turn away either. Later, when he left the room, he noticed the bowl was empty. She had eaten while he was gone. It was a beginning, a fragile thread of hope. She was still locked in silence, still carrying her invisible wounds, but she had shown him something real. She had shown him that somewhere deep inside, she still wanted to connect, still wanted to be human, or at least to be loved. David smiled to himself. The shelter workers had been wrong. She wasn't useless. She wasn't broken. She was just waiting for someone to see her, to care enough to stay. And as he looked across the room at the small girl sitting silently in the corner, David promised himself one thing. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard it became, he would not give up on Lyra. Days slowly turned into weeks, and David's small home began to feel less empty. Lyra still did not speak, but she moved more than before. She would sometimes walk from her corner to the table when she thought David wasn't watching. She would quietly pick up food, eat a little, then hurry back. It wasn't much, but it was change. David never pushed her. He only gave her space and patience. But along with these small signs of progress came something strange. David began to notice little things that made no sense. One night, while he was fixing a lamp, Lyra sat in the corner hugging her knees. The lamp flickered suddenly, though he had just repaired it. When she turned her face away, the flicker stopped. Another time, when she cried softly in her sleep, the heater in the room sparked and released a wave of hot air, almost burning out. David at first thought it was bad wiring. The house was old, after all. But it happened again and again, always when Lyra was upset, always when her emotions ran high. Machines in the house would hum, lights would flicker, small objects would shake. It was as if the room itself reacted to her feelings. He watched her carefully one evening. She sat by the window, staring at the falling rain outside. David gently placed a toy on the table, a small wooden bird he had carved. Lyra glanced at it, her eyes softening just for a second. Then, almost shyly, she reached out her hand. The toy slid across the table toward her, though her fingers had not touched it. David froze. Lyra grabbed the toy quickly, holding it tight against her chest, her eyes wide with fear. She looked at David, expecting anger, expecting him to shout or leave. Instead, he only said quietly, "It's okay. I saw nothing." His calm voice made her lower her head again, but he noticed her shoulders shaking. She was scared, not of him, but of herself. The truth was clear now. Lyra wasn't just a sad, broken child. She was hiding something powerful, something dangerous. The neighbors began to notice as well. David heard whispers outside his door. One alien woman muttered, "That human took the cursed girl." Another added, "I saw light in his window last night. It wasn't normal." Rumors grew quickly in the city, spreading like fire. People said the girl could destroy homes, that she was marked, that she was the reason her family was gone. One evening, David was returning from the market when two men stopped him. Their faces were serious, their eyes filled with suspicion. "We've heard things," one said. "That girl in your house, she's dangerous. You should give her back before she brings ruin on you." David stood tall, his voice firm. "She's a child, not a weapon. Leave her alone." The men sneered but walked away, muttering darkly. Inside the house, Lyra had been waiting. She must have sensed the tension outside, because when David entered, she was curled tighter than ever in her blanket, her glowing blue eyes watching him with fear. He placed the food on the table and knelt down. "Don't worry," he said softly. "No one will take you away from me." That night, something happened that changed everything. David woke to a loud noise, the sound of metal falling. He rushed to the living room and found Lyra sitting on the floor, trembling. Around her, small objects were scattered, the wooden bird broken in half. The air smelled like burned wires, and the lights were flashing wildly. Lyra's face was wet with tears, her small hands pressed against her ears as if she wanted to block out the whole world. David ran to her, ignoring the sharp heat from the sparking wires. He wrapped his arms around her tightly. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's okay, Lyra. You're safe." At first, she struggled as if she thought she would hurt him too. But David held on. Slowly, the lights calmed, the sparks died, and the room fell silent again. When she finally stopped shaking, she whispered something for the first time. Her voice was so soft that David almost thought he imagined it. Sorry? The word was broken, but it was real. David pulled back, shocked, but his eyes filled with warmth. You don't need to say sorry, he told her. You didn't do anything wrong. Lyra lowered her head again, her hair falling over her face, but David could see the battle inside her. She wanted to speak, to reach out, but fear held her back. He knew she had been told her whole life that she was dangerous, cursed. That belief had buried her voice deep inside. The next day, the whispers in the city grew louder. People pointed when David walked by. Some shook their heads, others crossed the street to avoid him. That human is keeping a monster, they said. Children in the neighborhood began daring each other to run close to David's door, only to scream and run away again. David realized their little world was shrinking. The shelter had given him warnings. The neighbors were watching. And now the city itself seemed to turn its eyes toward his home. But Lyra clung to him more. When he returned home each evening, she was waiting by the door, her eyes following his every move. When thunder rolled outside one night, she even grabbed the edge of his sleeve, holding on with trembling fingers until the storm passed. It was the smallest touch, but it was the first time she had reached for him on her own. David's heart ached. He knew now that Lyra carried a secret too heavy for any child. A secret that made others fear her, but one that didn't change who she really was. She wasn't a monster. She was just a girl, broken by the world, afraid of herself. And as the whispers outside grew louder, David made himself a silent promise. No matter what powers she had, no matter what dangers came, he would never let the world take her away from him. He would protect her, even if it meant standing against everyone else. David decided Lyra could not stay hidden inside the small house forever. If she was to heal, she needed to see the world outside, to walk among people, even if only for a short while. One bright afternoon, he held out his hand and said, "Come with me." She looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes, but when he stepped outside, she followed slowly, her thin frame trembling as if the air itself was dangerous. The street was crowded with aliens of many shapes and sizes. Some had glowing horns, others had tails that swayed behind them, and some floated slightly above the ground. Lyra walked close to David, almost pressing against his side. She kept her head down, but the crowd noticed her. Whispers started. "That's the human's girl. Isn't she the cursed one from the shelter? Why is he bringing her here?" The words followed them like shadows. David pretended not to hear, but Lyra did. Her steps grew smaller, her shoulders hunched, and her glowing eyes stayed locked on the ground. David gently touched her shoulder. "It's all right," he whispered. "Just keep walking." They reached the small marketplace, where vendors shouted about fruits, tools, and cloth. David wanted to show her something simple, something normal, like buying a piece of bread. But before he could, a group of older alien children noticed them. Their eyes narrowed, and one of them pointed. "Look," he sneered, "it's the broken one." Lyra froze. David felt her hand tighten around his sleeve, but the children came closer. They were taller, stronger, and their voices were sharp. "She doesn't belong here," one said. "She's dangerous." Another reached out and shoved her shoulder. Lyra stumbled, nearly falling. David moved forward, anger rising in his chest. "Stop it," he said firmly. "Leave her alone." But the children only laughed. "Why protect her?" one boy mocked. "She'll destroy you, like she destroyed her own family." Lyra's body shook. Tears welled in her glowing eyes, and her hands pressed tightly together. She didn't want to fight, but the pressure of their mocking words and their cruel touch pushed her to the edge. Suddenly, a strange force rippled through the air. The boys who had shoved her were thrown back a few steps, as if invisible hands had pushed them hard. They fell to the ground, their faces pale with shock. The entire marketplace went silent. Every eye turned toward Lyra. She stood trembling, her chest rising and falling quickly, her face filled with terror. She hadn't meant to do it. It had just happened, and now everyone had seen. Gasps filled the crowd. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "She's dangerous," another shouted. The vendors stepped back from their stalls, mothers pulled their children away, and the space around David and Lyra grew wider. Fear spread like fire in the air. David quickly bent down and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. She was shaking violently, her tears streaming down. She expected him to step back, to let her go, to agree with the crowd that she was dangerous. That was what everyone else had always done. But David didn't move away. He held her tighter, his voice strong but gentle. "You're not broken," he whispered into her ear. "Do you hear me? You're not broken." Lyra's breath hitched. Her glowing eyes looked up at him, searching for the rejection she had always known. But it wasn't there. He was still there, standing firm, his arms steady around her. The crowd murmured in disbelief. A human protecting her? After what they had just seen? Some shook their heads, some spat on the ground, but David didn't care. He turned to the bullies still sitting on the ground. "If you touch her again," he said firmly, "you'll answer to me." The boys looked down, too frightened to reply. Lyra's hand moved slowly. She reached for David's coat, her thin fingers gripping the fabric tightly, as if it were the only solid thing in the world. Her eyes still glistened with tears, but there was something else there now. Something fragile, but alive. Trust. David guided her away from the crowd, ignoring the whispers and stares. People would talk. They always did, but what mattered was the small hand gripping his side. She hadn't let go. For the first time, she chose to hold on. When they reached the quieter street, Lyra stopped walking. She looked up at him, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. David knelt to meet her eyes. "You're safe," he said softly. "I'm not leaving you." She didn't speak, but she nodded slightly, the faintest movement of her head. Then she pressed the wooden toy bird, the one David had fixed for her, into his hand. Her way of saying she understood. That night, back at home, David noticed something different. She sat closer to him at the table, not at the far end. When he set down the food, she didn't wait until he left the room. She picked up the spoon, her hands still shaking, and began to eat while he sat across from her. She didn't look at him often, but the wall between them was thinner now. Later, when the lights dimmed and the house grew quiet, David lay awake, thinking of the moment in the marketplace. He had seen her power, yes, but more importantly, he had seen her fear. She wasn't a danger by choice. She was just a child who had been hurt too much. As he closed his eyes, he felt a soft tug at his blanket. Lyra had moved closer in the dark. She didn't say anything, but she sat near him, her presence quiet but steady. And David understood. She no longer wanted to be alone. The saddest girl from the shelter, the one everyone said was broken, had finally held on to someone. And this time, she wasn't letting go. The days after the marketplace incident were heavy with whispers and stares. Everywhere David went, eyes followed him. Some filled with pity, others with anger, most with fear. People crossed the street when they saw him holding Lyra's hand. Vendors stopped speaking when he passed. Children were pulled away by their parents. It was as if an invisible wall had risen between him and the rest of the city. Lyra felt it too. She clung to him even more tightly now, her glowing eyes darting nervously at every voice and every shadow. At night, she sometimes woke trembling, whispering words in her alien tongue. David didn't understand the words, but he understood the fear in her voice. Each time, he stayed awake beside her, speaking softly until her breathing calmed again. But fear outside the house was not the worst of it. One evening, heavy knocking shook David's door. When he opened it, 3 officials in black uniforms stood there. Their tall helmets hid their faces, but their voices were cold and sharp. "We've heard reports," the one in front said. "The child you adopted is not safe. She is property of the state. Hand her over." Lyra, hiding behind David, shook so hard her teeth almost chattered. David placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her, and faced the officials. "She is not property," he said firmly. "She's a child." The official tilted his head. "A dangerous child. She will harm you. She will harm everyone around her. This is your only warning. Return her to us or face punishment." David's jaw tightened. "No, she stays with me." The officials exchanged looks. The one in front leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "Do not be foolish, human. When the time comes, you will not be able to protect her." With that, they turned sharply and walked away, their boots striking the ground like drums of war. David closed the door, his hands trembling, but when he looked down at Lyra, his fear turned into resolve. She was staring at him, her eyes wide and wet, waiting for the words she feared most, that he would send her away. But David knelt in front of her, brushing her silver hair back from her face. "I will never give you to them," he said. "Not today, not ever." For the first time, Lyra's lips moved. Her voice was broken, weak, as if the words had been buried inside her for years. "Don't leave me." David froze. His chest felt heavy, but warm at the same time. The sound of her voice was fragile, like glass, but also powerful. He smiled softly, nodding. "Never," he whispered. "I promise." That night, the city outside seemed darker, the whispers louder, the shadows heavier. David sat by the window, watching the street, waiting for more soldiers to arrive. His mind raced with plans. What if they came in numbers? What if they dragged him away? What if Lyra was taken back to the shelter or somewhere worse? But each time the fear grew too strong, he looked at the small figure sleeping on the floor with her blanket wrapped tightly around her, and the fear melted into determination. The next day, David tried to act normal. He took Lyra for a walk in a quieter part of the city, away from the market. The streets there were emptier, the air calmer. For a moment, it almost felt safe. But even there, he noticed shadows moving. A tall alien woman quickly pulled her child away, muttering, "Monster." A vendor refused to sell him bread, shaking his head and pointing at Lyra. It was clear, fear of her was spreading. That evening, more knocks came at the door. This time, it wasn't the officials. It was the neighbors. A group of them stood together, faces stern, eyes filled with judgment. One stepped forward. "We want peace here," he said. "That girl of yours, she threatens it. If you care for her, send her away. If not, you will bring trouble on all of us." David stood in the doorway, Lyra clutching his sleeve from behind. He could feel her body shaking like a leaf. His voice came out steady, though his heart pounded. "She is not a threat. She is not leaving." The neighbors muttered among themselves. Some spat on the ground, some shook their heads. One said, "Then don't expect us to help you when they come for her." With that, they left, their footsteps echoing in the silence. David closed the door and leaned against it, exhausted. Lyra tugged his sleeve gently. When he looked down, she whispered again, clearer this time. "Stay." His throat tightened. He knelt and hugged her close, his hand resting on the back of her head. "I'll stay," he promised. "I'll fight for you." The next days turned into hiding. David kept the windows closed, the door locked. He rationed food, leaving only when necessary. Each time he stepped outside, he felt eyes following him, waiting, measuring. But each time he returned, Lyra was waiting at the door, her glowing eyes fixed on him like a lifeline. She spoke little, only a word here or there, but her presence grew stronger. She stayed close, always reaching for his hand, his sleeve, his coat, anything to remind herself he was real and still there. One night, the sound of boots thundered outside again. David's heart leapt as he rushed to the window. Soldiers. Their dark figures moved along the street, scanning houses, their helmets glowing faintly in the night. They were searching. They would come for her soon. Lyra sensed it. She pressed against David's side, whispering in her broken voice, "Don't. Let them." David tightened his arm around her, his jaw set like stone. "I won't," he said. His voice was quiet, but it was filled with steel. "Not as long as I breathe." And in that dimly lit room, as shadows passed by the window, David realized something powerful. This was no longer just about protecting a child. This was about standing against a world that wanted to break her. And he would stand, even if he had to stand alone. The night they came was darker than usual. Clouds covered the moon, and the air was heavy with silence. David sat near the window, his rifle resting against the wall, though he hoped he would never have to use it. Lyra sat close to him, her silver hair falling over her face, her hands gripping his sleeve tightly. She hadn't spoken a word that evening, but her trembling told him everything. She knew they were coming. The sound of boots broke the silence, dozens of them striking the ground together. David's heart pounded as shadows moved outside. Soldiers in black armor marched into the street, their glowing helmets shining like predators' eyes in the dark. They surrounded the house, weapons ready. One of them called out, his voice booming, "Human, surrender the girl. This is your last chance. She belongs to the state." David stood, his fists clenched. He shouted back, "She belongs to no one. She's a child, and she stays with me." There was no answer, only the order to move. The door crashed open, splinters flying. Soldiers poured inside, their metal boots striking the floor. David grabbed his rifle and fired once, not to kill, but to warn. The shot echoed through the room. But they kept coming, their steps heavy and merciless. Lyra screamed, not with words, but with pure fear. The lights in the room flickered wildly, sparks leaping from the wires. A table rattled, chairs slid across the floor. The soldiers hesitated, but their leader shouted, "Take her!" David fought with all his strength. He swung his rifle, knocked one soldier back, shoved another into the wall. But there were too many. They pushed him down, their weapons raised. One soldier reached for Lyra, his armored hand grabbing her arm. In that moment, something inside her broke. A sound like thunder filled the house, but it wasn't from the sky. It came from her. Her glowing blue eyes burned brighter than ever, and her small body shook with force she could no longer contain. The air exploded. A wave of invisible energy blasted outward, throwing soldiers into the walls. Weapons shattered, metal bent as if it were soft clay. Windows cracked, the door ripped off its hinges, and the very ground seemed to tremble. David shielded his face, the shockwave nearly knocking him down. But he forced himself to stay upright, his eyes locked on Lyra. She stood in the middle of the chaos, tears streaming down her face, her hands outstretched as if pushing the entire world away. The soldiers groaned on the ground, their armor dented, their weapons useless. Sparks rained from the broken lights above. The leader struggled to rise, but when he saw her glowing with raw energy, even he froze. For the first time, fear filled his eyes. Lyra's scream faded into sobs. The power dimmed, the glow in her eyes flickering like a dying flame. Her knees buckled, and she almost collapsed, but David rushed forward and caught her in his arms. She buried her face against his chest, shaking uncontrollably. He whispered to her, his voice steady despite the storm around them. "It's okay. You're safe. I've got you." The soldiers who could still move crawled back, dragging their injured comrades with them. None dared to come closer. The leader shouted a retreat, his voice cracking with fear. "Fall back! Fall back!" Within moments, the street outside was filled with running boots, the sound fading into the night. Silence returned, broken only by Lyra's quiet sobs and the crackling of broken wires. The house was in ruins, furniture shattered, walls cracked, the door gone, but they were still standing. David held her tightly, his hand on the back of her head, whispering again and again, "You're not a monster. You're not broken. You're just a child. My child." Lyra slowly lifted her face, her glowing eyes meeting his. They were filled with pain, with guilt, with fear that he too would now see her as a danger. But all she saw in his eyes was warmth and strength. "You saved me," David said, his voice soft but firm. "Don't ever be ashamed of that. What you did wasn't evil. It was to protect us." Her lips trembled, and for the first time she spoke more than one word. Her voice was broken, heavy with tears. "I didn't want to hurt them." David brushed her hair back gently. I know, Lyra. That's what makes you different. You have power, yes, but you also have a heart, and that's what matters." She clung to him tighter, burying her face in his chest again. The house around them was broken, the city outside filled with fear, but in that moment, David felt something stronger than fear. He felt hope. Because Lyra was no longer silent. She was no longer only the saddest girl in the shelter. She had shown her true self, fragile, powerful, afraid, but still a child who wanted nothing more than to be loved. David knew the officials would not stop. They would come again, perhaps with more soldiers, perhaps with bigger weapons. But he also knew he could never let them win. Not after seeing the tears in her eyes, not after hearing the trembling sound of her voice. As he held her in his arms, he whispered one last promise into the night. "I'll protect you, Lyra, no matter who comes, no matter what it takes. You'll never be alone again." The days after the attack were unlike anything David had ever known. His home was broken, the walls cracked, the door gone, but he repaired it as best he could. He worked with his bare hands, hammering, fixing, patching, while Lyra sat nearby, watching him silently. She no longer hid in the corner. She stayed close, sometimes holding a nail or passing him a tool. She was still afraid, but she was no longer hiding from him. The city, however, was not quiet. Word of what had happened spread quickly. People spoke the blast of energy, of soldiers thrown like toys, of a human protecting the cursed girl. Some spoke in fear, saying the girl should be destroyed. Others whispered with awe, saying she might be special, even chosen. The streets buzzed with rumors, and every eye turned to David's house. One morning, David stepped outside and found children waiting in the street. Not ordinary children, but others like Lyra, thin, scared, with glowing eyes or strange marks on their skin. They looked at him with silent hope. One boy stepped forward and said, "We saw what she did. We are like her. Please, help us." David froze. He looked at Lyra, who stood beside him, holding his sleeve. Her glowing eyes met his, and in them he saw the answer. She was no longer alone. There were more like her, more children hiding, more broken spirits waiting for someone to protect them. He opened the door wide. "Come inside," he said. "You're safe here." Slowly, the children entered, their small feet dragging as if they expected a trap. Lyra looked at them with wide eyes, unsure at first. Then one little girl smiled shyly at her, and Lyra's face softened. For the first time, she reached out her hand not to David, but to another child. The girl took it, and together they sat on the floor, whispering quietly. From that day, the house was no longer quiet. Laughter returned, soft at first, then louder as the children grew braver. Lyra, once silent and alone, became a sister to them, teaching them how to stay calm, showing them they were not cursed, not broken. But the danger was not gone. Officials returned, this time with more soldiers and harsher threats. They demanded David hand over all the children. "They are weapons," one shouted. "They belong to us." David stood firm in the doorway, his voice unshaken. "They belong to no one. They are children, and they will not be taken." Behind him, Lyra and the others stood together, their eyes glowing faintly. They were afraid, but they did not hide anymore. The soldiers moved forward, ready to fight, but something unexpected happened. The neighbors who once whispered against David stepped out of their houses. Some looked uncertain, but others stood closer. A woman shouted, "They're just children." An old man added, "We cannot let the state steal them again." More voices rose, and soon the street was filled with people standing between the soldiers and David's home. The officials realized the tide had turned. They could not fight the whole street, not when the people themselves were beginning to resist. With angry words, they pulled back, warning David that this was not the end. But their retreat was real, and for the first time, David felt the city itself had begun to change. That night, when the house was quiet again, David sat with Lyra by the small fire. She leaned against him, her head resting on his arm. The other children slept nearby, curled in blankets. For a long time, they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Finally, Lyra spoke. Her voice was still small, but it carried a strength it never had before. "Papa," she whispered. David's chest tightened. The word was simple, but it held more weight than any promise, more strength than any vow. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Yes," he said softly, "I'm here." Lyra smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her glowing eyes. She had been the saddest girl in the shelter, unwanted, forgotten, called cursed and broken. But now, sitting beside him, surrounded by children like her, she was no longer alone. She had found a family. The world outside was still dangerous. Officials would return, soldiers would march again, and whispers of fear would continue. But David knew something had changed forever. The children had seen hope, the city had seen courage, and Lyra had found her voice, her strength, and her place. What came next? No one could predict. But as David watched the firelight reflect in Lyra's eyes, he knew one truth. She was not cursed, not broken. She was his daughter now, and together they would face whatever future awaited them.